the levers framework is a way of really organizing these levers. So these changes in the mind of a user, which we think are going to impact behavior, into a standardized set of categories. It's organized in a kind of hierarchical structure, with each level describing kind of subcategories of the level above it.
Hi, my name is Romo Santiago, and I'm the founder of Experiment Nation. In today's episode, Charlotte Bumford speaks to Edmund Beggs about his levers framework for categorizing conversion rate optimization experiments and insights based on how they impact the user's mindset. The framework provides a common vocabulary and structure for practitioners to organize data, prioritize which experiments to run, and conduct meta-analysis across many programs. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to another Experiment Nation podcast. I am your host, Charlotte Bumford. Today's podcast is quite exciting because we will be interviewing Edmund Beggs, who is a CRO consultant for Conversion.com and is the mastermind behind our topic. Would you mind introducing yourself further, Edmund?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good introduction for me. I'm a conversion rate optimization consultant, but I have a particularly strong interest in conversion rate optimization methodology, developing frameworks to help us kind of work and particularly learn at scale in more efficient, more robust ways.
Awesome. That's actually a good introduction as well. So, right, let's get into it because this is something that you guys have been working on and it's exciting to announce. Right, levers framework. First, what is a lever and why is it important to CRO?
Sure. So levers, I think, can be described really as a way of talking about, describing, denoting something that's going on in the mind of a user, which can influence their behavior. Practically for us, they are ways to group experiments based on the similarities in how these experiments are likely to impact the mind of a user. And that focus really on how the user is thinking is really central to it. They're intended to apply across lots of possible executions, different ways you might run different kinds of experiments to offer us broader learnings. So we're not interested just in the specific components involved. For example, we're really interested in those broader themes that come out across experiments. And I think, that can sound a bit abstract, but with an example, it can be pretty straightforward. I think if you were to take a really simple experiment, like you're adding a 4.6 star Trustpilot rating to a website homepage, maybe at the bottom of the hero section, and you run the experiment and you want to think about what are we learning, and likewise, how would you even describe what it is you tested? Because there's a very literal way in which you could just describe the exact implementation, right? It was a 4.6 Trustpilot rating. Maybe there's a number of reviews associated with it on that particular position on the page, on that particular website. But we really wouldn't want to limit our learning from that experiment there. It wouldn't tell us a lot about what we should do next. And so that's really where levers come in. They're a way of describing your independent variable, what we're trying to change in an experiment, at a slightly higher level. So in this case, adding Trustpilot rating, we think it's probably something to do with trust is, a broad way you could construe that experiment. If you wanted to be a bit more specific, you might think in terms of the credibility of your site. So how reliable do you seem? How plausible are the positive claims that you're going to make about your product or service? And you could even get a bit more specific there and think, well, are we talking about social proof specifically, the way that we can appeal to people like you as a user in order to seem more credible here? So, I think you can see there, it's all about finding another way to think about your change, one that can be applied to other changes. Even within social proof, you might think about testimonials as an alternative way to do it. Or if you're taking a slightly broader view on that independent variable, again, credibility more widely, you might look at what we call authority-driven credibility. So that appeals to authoritative third parties. It could be reputable brands you're associated with, third-party institutions that have validated you in some way. And critically, when we start placing these categories of levers on top of experiments that are, in a sense, about testing an exact execution, it brings out this central idea, which is that the independent variable and the hypothesis of a CRO experiment can be defined in a lot of different ways. And that these interpretations, how we decide to describe our experiments and what we're changing, is going to impact what you're able to learn from an experiment, what kinds of claims, the outcome of an experiment can be brought as evidence for or against. And that really is the core of the levers framework itself, because we're looking to describe the changes of an experiment at 3 levels of generality, again, based on what it is they're doing in the mind of the user as we understand it.
That's very interesting. You said it very well. But we want to expand further. Can you tell us what is the levers framework?
Sure. So
This is Romo Santiago from Experiment Nation. Every week we share interviews with and conference sessions by our favorite conversion rate optimizers from around the world. So if you like this video, smash that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us a bunch. Now back to the episode.
the levers framework is a way of really organizing these levers. So these changes in the mind of a user, which we think are going to impact behavior, into a standardized set of categories. It's organized in a kind of hierarchical structure, with each level describing kind of subcategories of the level above it. So at the highest level of generality, right at the top, we have just 5 pretty simple categories, but very broad ones. So cost, trust, usability, comprehension, and motivation. I think concepts will be familiar to CRO practitioners. But each of these concepts is then going to have some categories that sit within it, and any experiment that sits in that category is also going to belong to the parent one above. So usability, for example, might be broken out into specific things related to user flow. So how do users understand, where they are, where they need to go next, what the next action is. Effort, how much friction are they feeling in the experience, how much do they anticipate it's going to be a lot of effort for them, and even how we prioritize attention and so on. Cost, again, can be broken out into, I think, probably the most intuitive side of it being the financial cost. So what are you paying for your product, how are you able to position that pricing in a way that makes it seem as appealing as possible. But the other side of that might be the soft costs. In order to benefit from some kinds of product, you need to put a little bit of work in. If you're looking at something like Duolingo, lots of educational products, and even newspaper subscriptions, there is something that you're going to have to contribute, some kind of additional downside baked into the use of the product, which you might also look to mitigate in your experiments. So that already brings us, I think, into a clearer image of how it's structured. We have these, broad categories at the top, then we get a little bit narrow within that, and then finally we have a third level, which is breaking out these kind of mid-level levers into what we call sub-levers. So our most granular kind of change in the mind of a user that we're looking to categorize. So to return to an example I mentioned before, credibility is one specific kind of trust, and that might be broken out into contrasted appeals to authority on the one hand, as I mentioned, and social proof on the other. So 2 different ways of achieving similar kinds of thing in the mind of a user, but with a slightly distinct foundation for each in terms of the kind of in terms of how we expect it to work in the mind of the user. Right, it's a different thing to appeal to people like you versus authorities, and in different contexts, one or the other might work better. And yeah, that's the core structure of it, and fundamentally what that's trying to manage, why we have 3 levels, is this trade-off between the bigger and the smaller categories. We started putting this together with, I think it was 130 fairly disparate kinds of lever categories we were using. Each practitioner could define their own categories used for their own work, but this obviously meant there was a degree of duplication, overlapping concepts, but also a real variety in really broadly scoped things, big concepts like UX sitting next to concepts that were, very specific to an industry or even one specific website. So we kind of had to make a decision, really, like how are we going to approach this problem? There are benefits and downsides really to each. We can take a small list of very broad categories to describe that space of experiments that we're running, that space of changes we're making in the mind of a user. And we can have a few very memorable, easy to learn things with large sample sizes. We do have some thousands of experiments in our database, but often you're segmenting by things like industry, the kind of page that you're working on. There are lots of other variables that are going to be relevant here. And so there is an advantage there to keeping that reliable sample size, albeit to a kind of category which is very broad. The narrow categories, on the other hand, these very specific things like sub-levers, they have the advantage that because the scope of that category is smaller, the average level of similarity basically between the concepts within that, so the experiments you might categorize there, is going to be smaller. So that difference is smaller, and therefore we expect there to be more predictive power, really, when you're going from historic experiments through to trying to estimate how might these experiments behave in the future. Understanding a category of experiments that are very similar to one another have behaved is going to give you a slight advantage there over the broader categories that contain kind of more disparate changes. So we try to kind of bridge these two things together. How can we have the flexibility to sometimes use very broad categories and sometimes use very refined and narrow ones? So you can adjust the level of the framework that you want to use, how specific the categories are to the kind of query you have, the amount of data you have in order to answer the questions. But you can also bridge some of that usability gap that would happen if we provided just a massive list of lots of very narrow categories, for example. Because if you start at the top of the tree, you have just 5 options to choose from. And by choosing one of those 5 options, you've already eliminated most of the possible categories that are there. You can repeat the same thing at the next level, and you've actually not had to compare a lot of things in order to quite efficiently sort your way through all of the options. And I think the final piece around the core structure of this that I think it can be really useful is that by grouping together your narrow concepts to describe kinds of experiment underneath broader ones, it can invite you to make horizontal movements. So you can see that, say, something like authority isn't working particularly well to solve your credibility problem. It invites you to consider the alternative solutions, which might belong under social proof, for example. So as much as we've worked a lot on the specific concepts that are going to fill into this framework, and they're ever evolving, this core structure is, I think, a big part of what gives it the strength it has when you start looking at how you can build strategies around it and conduct meta-analysis.
That's actually a very interesting thing that you're saying right now. And I think like CROs around the world would be like, okay, if I'm going to start this new experimentation program, how would that framework work into, the program that we're working on?
Sure. Well, the short answer is that levers get embedded as a pretty core concept, really, across the strategy. They're going to inform, if you recommit to this process, how you group and interpret insights about your users as you gather them through user research, all the way through the strands of experiments you're going to explore. So, how you're going to structure your ability to learn, pivot, and iterate on what kinds of experiments are likely to be most effective through prioritization and meta analysis and so on. But yeah, if we kind of walk through each step a little bit, I think it'll become a little bit clearer how that works. So let's say you're right at the start of an experimentation program, you haven't actually necessarily run any experiments yet, and you're trying to think about, how can I develop a better understanding of users? You've hopefully gone a bit beyond best practice. You're trying to develop a richer understanding of how users behave in the specific context of your site, deployed some maybe mixed methods research. You have some analytics data combined with maybe usability testing surveys and so on, and some foundational insights, basically. One of the first things you can look to do is categorize these insights, group them together based on these categories from the lever framework. You could, for example, if you see a lack of brand confidence, categorize it under trust, maybe at the broadest level. But again, you might have data specifically suggesting probably this is credibility, and maybe even a problem with a lack of social proof or authority. It really depends on what the data is saying. But the key thing is that if you have these broader themes in order to group your specific insights, it's already helping you to build out your mental model of what matters most to users. It's a way to put all the different insights you might get together and manage the fact that some of them may be positive under some negative, and kind of work through them under coherent groupings and get a kind of top line priority. Where is it that we need to start looking and focusing with our initial experiments? From there, when you have your top line priorities from levers, it can, if you have access to the data, be a really useful thing to look at what other solutions already exist. So at Conversion, we benefit from having these thousands of experiments in our database. Once we get a kind of at least heuristic mental model, or as we add more research, a kind of more fleshed out full view of how users think on our site, we can use that to look at what kinds of solutions have been effective in the past at resolving
That's
problems or
interesting.
opportunities under a
Hmm.
given lever. Um, But even if you don't have that data, I mean, it gives you a way to structure your thinking to get out there and start looking for solutions or to create entirely new ones. It's all about having a clear cut mental model that's going to help you build out a backlog of experiments that are actually aligned to the things that users are indicating in your research are problems or opportunities. Um, and
So
if
it
I,
is
yeah,
kind of like a list of experiments that's already done based on the methodology. So it kind of like saves time, especially for a new zero experimentation program.
yeah, no, exactly that.
Mm,
And again, it actually comes back in a way to the structure of the framework. An advantage of having those narrow categories that you can work your way down to is that you can restrict the set of possible things that might come up. So
mm, mm.
a set of solutions, particularly if you're looking at a larger database that might be applicable for social proof, can be much smaller than those that are applicable to trust more broadly. So if you can get that more specific understanding of your problem, you benefit from a more efficient search for what kinds of solutions worked well.
I like this. That's very interesting.
Um, but yeah, and that's obviously a key part of the process, actually going from research through to experiments. But often as important a thing is determining which of those experiments you ought to run, right? Which things you ought to prioritize. And again, that is somewhere that if you have organized your insights around these lever level categories, it should tell you something about which ones should be prioritized, so which ones are most important. And this is even stronger again if you have the benefit of a database you might build up over time, because it's going to give you some data from meta-analysis, which we can maybe go into in more detail. I think it's a rich topic
It
in its
is
own
quite
right.
a rich topic, yeah.
Um, but we've invested a lot in conversion and trying to find these robust and automated ways to use the massive amount of data in the database. That means using the performance of in experiments that may be outside a particular program. So they're not necessarily run on our website. Maybe they just run in that industry or more broadly, but they're run under that same kind of change in the mind of a user. And that can already tell you something about how you ought to rank these experiments, which one you ought to focus on trying to run, and following that thread through. What is it you're learning when you run each experiment, and so how should you look to iterate? You take that really valuable data that is the A/B test itself, something which is can be really robust using this real world data. To then teach you even more and tell you, you need to do more of this kind of thing, less of another kind of thing. And actually, as a side note, I should mention here, when you're going through that process of going from one experiment and deciding what else to do under that lever, it's really important to pay attention to the losing experiments as well. I think it can become easy to just double down on the winner and ignore the loser. But actually, what we've seen again in some of our meta-analysis is that direct iterations on a loser actually outperform direct iterations on a winner. So often it's as much about trying to understand in your specific context what matters most to users and how can we find a way to actually solve that. Again, thinking in terms of which levers seem to have the biggest impact on users, whether it's positive or negative, and then how do we leverage that in order to generate a positive experience out of it. And yeah, that's, I guess, a foundational part of how we want to work, right? We want to use our A/B test to learn over time, and levers are fundamentally about trying to do that. We don't abandon our most specific sublevers after just one test, because we know the execution itself can be really responsible for what's going on, specifics of the context. Instead, we're looking for cumulative data over time, all organized around these levers and giving us those opportunities to make the horizontal shifts once we have accumulated more data. We know from running several experiments that these appeals to authority aren't as effective. How can we solve this credibility problem via social proof? So you can kind of see how all the way through, from how do we organize our insights, through how should we follow those threads to coming up with concepts, to prioritizing those concepts, and then making sure that we learn from the experiments we run over time, that it can really formulate quite a deep part of the strategy that kind of follows a thread from start to the iterative process that goes on through an
Mm,
experimentation program.
amazing. So how does the levers framework enable meta-analysis, and why is this so important?
Yeah, this is, I think, maybe where the levers framework is most valuable. I think where the work that's being done with it is most interesting, and was a major reason that we started working on it in the first place. And fundamentally, it comes back to wanting to approach CRO like a science. When we're doing A/B testing, proper A/B testing, we're adopting a scientific method. We're using randomized controlled trials and statistical analysis to make informed decisions. We want to develop a robust understanding of the phenomena of interest, and that in our context is user behavior on our websites of study, right? So we want to take all the lessons we can take from science, all the rigor of the scientific method, and do that properly. And one specific thing I think we need to be really conscious of is that there are problems facing other areas of science, particularly those concerned with understanding and predicting human behavior. It's now, I think, pretty well known that quite a few high profile findings in psychology and behavioral science have been shown to either be a bit misleading or less impactful, or at least only partly true, let's say. And there have been, lots of prominent examples of this. A couple of things that really captured the popular imagination to a real extent, I think, were concepts like power poses and grit, which were popularized by TED Talks, which both led to a bit of controversy because some components of them seem to replicate and others not. um, those may be familiar examples, but there's a much deeper problem going on here, in behavioral science, which is some of the longer standing foundational work on things like priming effects done by Daniel Kahneman has come under really extensive criticism about how impactful it is, and even the existence of some of these kinds of effects where these little cues in the environment are leading to big changes in behavior. Some people are concerned about the entire idea of small nudges being an effective way to induce substantial behavior change. And actually, there are mainstream or the mainstream estimates of how often we expect experiments to replicate in, for example, social psychology. Is they're less than 50%. They may be as low as 20 to 25%. So very often things that are seeming very interesting in a narrow set of experiments, or just the one-off programs that are being done, actually don't seem to replicate very well when they're subjected to the wider challenge of being tested in different ways, in different contexts, and stretching to see that the scope of the theory behind it actually works everywhere that it's predicted to. And you know, we know that CRO experiments aren't going to be exempt from this. We're often looking at bigger theories and claims that are going to come from our experiments. Bigger claims like credibility is really important for subscription companies, for example. These are claims that are going to be underdetermined by the data from any one experiment, and we need to go through that kind of rigorous scientific process of replicating experiments, running experiments, and collecting data across lots of iterations of them to see how effective they actually are in practice. Making more novel predictions and seeing that they replicate, I think, is probably the fundamental thing that's come out in terms of how we can learn beyond the kind of mistakes that can happen within individual experiments, whether because they were tested in too narrow a context, because there were mistakes in the statistics used, just genuine randomness, or just errors in the research design itself. These are all things that can thwart any one experiment. It's on aggregate. It's over time, testing things again and again, that we learn. And lever level claims in particular are not going to be exempt from that. They are by definition broader than the claim made about any one execution. So if we want to be able to make those big claims that credibility stimulus is important, as I say, or kinds of usability are particularly important in one industry or another, kinds of motivation work well in one industry or another, they can't be confirmed or falsified based on one or even a handful of A/B tests. We need to have a way to accumulate data from a larger sample across varied executions, and that's what we're using the lever framework to do. And in fact, that is one of the main motivations to develop it in the first place, is to have a common vocabulary and mental model to actually collect data at that kind of scale. We have programs that are going to be run by on different industries, different websites, but also by different practitioners over months and years. So how is it that we can have an underlying framework to help us capture this data, whether it starts in a fairly straightforward way, which is just, do we get a better estimate of the overall win rate or effect size associated with a particular group of experiments? Just some simple descriptive data from your program, that can already yield some great results. And we've seen, particularly in these longer term strategies where there's lots of data tested there, and they can really exploit those sub levers, those narrower sets of really similar levers that they can really find under and over exploited levers. So things that we need to do more of or less of based on what we've done historically. And I think one really useful lesson from that, for anyone who's already got an experimentation program but is interested in trying to leverage levers to learn more, is that we've recategorized the strategy of behind experiments for programs which were using a different set of categories from before we started implementing the levers framework. And it's actually opened up learning. So we found that when you define it in terms of a particular sublever, you end up discovering that, in fact, this has always worked well, but we've really not tested it as much as we've tested other things. So it's an underexploited area. But once you start to collect larger data sets than that, and I think you can get into a really kind of exciting and powerful place with this, is when you can start to deploy machine learning as we've been doing. So we've started to use confidence AI in order to take these thousands of data points that we have to generate stronger predictions about the outcome of an experiment. I think we're looking at something like 60% accuracy at the minute. We want to feed more data through this. We want to train it more, get better and better predictions. But so far, the data is just really promising. It seems like something that's likely to, substantially outperform the standard industry win rates. And while levers are just one part of this prediction, we also categorize based on the execution, the psychological principles, and so on. We know from the data that the lever, when combined with the industry, is the most important thing. So these are the two variables that, taken together, are weighted most strongly in this model. So if there's one kind of new tagging that you'd want to introduce for meta-analysis, our data strongly suggests that the levers framework is a really powerful way to do that, to generate these more robust learnings in the long term.
It does sound like that. That does sound like it's a robust learning that we're going to get. This looks like a huge advantage for CRO worldwide. And just a question then, how's the levers framework being used as an educational tool?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it's not necessarily one that we had in mind. I think my intention when we first set out to consolidate our lever categories into a consistent framework, it was really about gathering high quality data for meta-analysis. It really was sort of more about this kind of background nerdier, but I think more exciting thing of just trying to improve the way that we collect data, and we can generate big picture learnings from it. It wasn't necessarily something that I ever imagined was going to be a more public facing tool, something that we would put out there in the world to open wider discussions. But in the years since the project first started back in, I think, in 2020, we've grown a lot, the conversion. We've been fortunate to grow from something like 25 people to 60.
Wow.
And this has meant a lot of new consultants coming in, right? A lot of new practitioners of
Hmm.
CRO with their own models, a lot of different ways of doing things, diverse and interesting ways that we can feed into our processes, but nonetheless, different ways of looking at things. And in particular, we took on quite a few junior consultants who actually, like me when I joined Conversion in 2020, were fresh graduates from a behavioral science background. So
Interesting.
people
Okay. Wow.
who
That's good.
are used to thinking about the way that people think, right, in a scientific
Yeah.
way, not necessarily
Hmm.
familiar with the specific kinds of changes that we make in CRO. And we have this kind of intensive process of learning where you get exposed to all these different kinds of experiment implementations really quickly, which is a fantastic and exciting experience. But it became clear that the levers framework was one way that we could introduce people who were newer to CRO to this, a way to structure this wide range of interventions on websites. There's so many different things you can do and so many different site contexts. How do we give people a kind of a common vocabulary, a common mental model to start organizing that? And now that's more widely spread at Conversion. All consultants, when they join, become really quite closely acquainted with the framework from early on, much more embedded in how we work now, and we have these better aligned mental models, more of a shared understanding. And I guess our hope is that as we put this out into the world more, as we invite more conversation around it, more feedback, that some of this vocabulary and way of thinking might spread further. But critically, I think that we can evolve it. We can cover more use cases that other people may have spotted, continue to evolve over time. And I think that comes back, to the ideal, I guess, behind a lot of this is we want to be doing good scientific work within our context and the kinds of behaviors that we're interested in. And these kinds of theories, approaches to things have to be able to evolve over time, right? They have to be able to be corrected and updated as we get better data, more data. And I think that's a big part of the ambition here. I'll be really interested to hear more about how people are using it, how it's working well for them, but critically, how it's not working well for them, how we can refine this and make it a more effective tool.
I'm actually like really interested in this topic and this lever framework because I think when I started as a CRO specialist, the first thing, you have all these quantitative, qualitative data. The first problem that I've usually encountered is like, where do I start? What's the
Yeah.
first solution and all that? And having this framework just eliminates a lot of things and stops you from wasting so much time on creating a solution that might not be, helpful in the end, or something that should be, um, won't be as effective with your users in a sample size like you've said. So it's actually very, very interesting that you guys have put this up. And yeah, so uh, the next topic I think that we're going to talk about is benchmarking. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep, yep. Okay, so the first question that I have would be, what is CRO competitor benchmarking at conversion?
Sure. So the way we use it at conversion is as a way to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of websites, particularly to gather a set of sites that share some kind of common challenge, theme, value proposition, whatever it is, and try and come up with metrics to describe how well they're doing across a range of things, which, going back to the levers framework, we have reason to think are likely to be important for their users. Specifically, I guess it's a way of assigning numerical values when you're actually, similar to what you were mentioning there, merging different kinds of data. So you may have a mix of, particularly lots of qualitative data, some heuristic analysis even in there. It's about trying to build out a set of questions that you can answer with these research methods that can give you a more systematic way of looking at the strengths and weaknesses of a site. So, how well are the tactics being deployed that might make the site more usable, persuasive, or trustworthy? And it's all about being able to compare as directly as possible. So, by having these structured questions, these fixed criteria, it makes it much easier for different practitioners working on these projects over time, for all the research designs behind user testing and surveys that might feed into this to be structured in a way which is actually going to feed back into an overall kind of coherent set of questions. We're at least always asking the same things of ourselves. We have some agreement on what's going to make up a good CRO architecture, and from there we can look at trying to fill in from more specific questions that might ladder up. So you can never have, I guess, a complete uh, common understanding of exactly how to interpret every bit of data, and particularly where you're leaning on kind of the expert review component, there's always going to be some differences there. But we know that everyone's at least asking themselves the same questions and doing it in the same structured way. And I think that's probably a fundamental thing, really, if you have the ambitions that we have with this, which is to make it something which is viable to be deployed at 6-month intervals to give more data on improvements in the insight performance over time. Obviously, it's notoriously kind of tricky when you start looking at a directly measurable metric like conversion rate over time, which is always fluctuating for so many reasons. So building out benchmarking is meant to be a way of demonstrating that progress is being made, but also finding where those opportunities are over time. So you have not just as one-off projects, but repeated projects and even comparison points across projects different industries that may share common features, and in the long term, just building up um, a database of this kind of stuff that then can provide, I think, some really interesting kind of bigger picture insights, right? So, um, the simple answer, I guess, to the initial question would be it's about trying to assign this standardized set of criteria to compare across websites. But as you can see there, hopefully there are important reasons for doing this and things that it allows you to do in the long term.
So, what's the difference about your approach to benchmarking?
I think, aside from the fact that the questions that make it up are based on this collaborative understanding we like to think of from the decades of cumulative CRO experience, that there is a convergence. So all the people who are feeding into this and I guess validated through the meta-analysis, it's that it's built around these categories from the levers framework, which we think we're increasingly demonstrating through our meta analysis in particular, is a really powerful way to categorize changes in the mindset of a user. So, knowing that the levers framework is conceptually coherent and picks out real things in the world, it gives us confidence that the way that we're grouping these scorings isn't arbitrary. It's not just, in the opinion of that practitioner makes sense. It's actually something which has been demonstrated to work in a lot of contexts. And this can provide a nice kind of headline, top level view of how each site is performing compared with one another. Just taking the top five, broadest master levers, so that cost, trust, usability, comprehension, and motivation, to give you a kind of at a glance view of what's likely to be performing well or poorly on a site. Um, I think to get into how you can get up to one of those top level categories, because they are very broad things, they're composites of lots of individual questions. So for cost, you might ask, is there compelling price framing being deployed, and are discounts being communicated effectively? For something like usability, it's going to be made up of lots of questions like, are the action buttons well placed and clearly labeled? Do field names clearly communicate what's needed for user input? And very practical things like that. Each of these, top line lever scores is going to be made up of 15 to 30 questions, depending on the context of the study is going to make some questions more relevant, which pages are being looked at, and so on. But it gives you a way of taking very practical, detailed things and building them up again into this kind of broader prioritization framework for where is it that we should look in order to have the best impact. And because it's structured in that way, it is a very complementary research exercise if you are building a program around levers already. You can feed directly into your strategic approach. You have all of your insights kind of gathered around these key top line metrics, a sense of which ones are performing well against other sites, and then you can follow that same conceptual thread, the idea of a lever, through the kinds of solutions and roadmaps that you're then going to go through, all the way into meta-analysis. So again, it just, by having a coherent mental model in your head of how it is you should describe the things that are going on on your website in the mind of a user, it just gives you that ability to jump from one step to the other without having to switch mental model every time. It gives you these groupings, and again, I think it's important to think of how it fits together with the lever framework, in terms of the lever framework not really being a heuristic set of recommendations of what you should invest in your site. So it's not saying that you should try and do all these things and not all these things at once. We obviously know that in one context or another, each one can be important, but you kind of need to fill in the data to understand on your specific site, or in your industry, or whatever the scope of your learning is, what are the most important things in that particular context. And this is a really nice way of structuring that research, because you have a comprehensive model, a very broad model like the levers framework, and then you also have a kind of comprehensive view of your research data by structuring it around these kinds of benchmarks for each lever. So you have data that matches up in the breadth and scope that it's going for, with the way that you're actually then going to pursue your strategy. And I think this is I guess a distinctive and important way about how we're using it, is that it is so complementary with the rest of how we're working.
It kind of like matches. So, as you've said, you have the framework and then you have the benchmarking, which kind of like complements the work that you've done in the framework and kind of like gives you what the next steps are and how the impact is of that specific um change on the website or any type of
Yeah.
platform. That's interesting. Question. Okay, so it's in conversion.com. How has it been deployed and what has worked well?
Yeah, so it's primarily been deployed as, I guess, a foundational research piece. So right at the start of an experimentation strategy and program, you're trying to understand where are we now and where should we focus our efforts. And this is a great time to run it, as I say, because you start filling in the details of the boxes that something like a levers framework can give you. I guess to give a tangible sense of what that might look like. So one of these competitor benchmarking projects was run for an online food vendor, and they were found in these kind of top line lever views to have real growth opportunity around the way that users perceive the costs of product options. So how are they best able to present the kind of price incentives that are there for users, and obviously, in food selling online, this is a really important thing, right? This is something that deals bundles are something that we know from other client contexts, is something that users are always looking for. But taking that top line view could then lead us into specific questions that we know are important to this big picture opportunity. So comparing to other sites, we know that this is something they need to do better at. How can they go about doing better at it? Well, then we can kind of use that to then dig down into the data behind it, and we found that there was a perceived lack of stuff conveying what deals and bundles were actually available. In fact, users who weren't logged in weren't seeing any of these, weren't having them surface to them as an incentive. So the natural step, as one of the first experiments you'd want to run, was just to introduce a variation which surfaced these deal options for users. But interestingly, still with gated content. So you could show users an image of what the bundle was, a name for it, but actually not showing what the content is to still maintain an incentive in order to sign up.
Hmm. Hmm.
And actually, it
Interesting.
managed to drive both sign-ups and the conversion rate itself. So a pretty tangible example of how you can start from, okay, what's my kind of top line dashboard almost of where we need to look, and then follow that thread down until it gives you the specifics that you need from the more detailed parts of user research and what you're going to do. I think one very neat example I heard about recently, a conversion was for a supermarket brand where they actually had, I guess, a really clear kind of big picture challenge that goes beyond just the website. It's about how they're perceived as a brand more broadly, and that was basically economical, but stereotyped as not as prestigious or reliable as some of the alternatives. And those are the exact kinds of bigger picture problems which you're going to see prioritized in this kind of benchmarking approach. When you see that the trust metrics just aren't there, there's not enough being done. The feedback from users isn't trusting enough. So working down the framework a bit, they've thought about, well, how can we apply authority as a way to resolve this problem? And through, I guess, quite a simple little implementation, but one which scales well across a natural user journey on that kind of supermarket website. It's just to highlight all the award-winning products that are there. So they had this kind of this rich collection of products that you can apply great
You have
authority to,
access,
is
you have to log in.
not being used. And yeah, so I think while actually this experiment hasn't yet been run, I think it's a really neat example of why prioritizing these bigger picture things like trust is important, because users aren't necessarily going to call out specifics on a listing page like, oh, there's no award-winning signposting going on here. They're going to raise across lots of different contexts and pages this wider concern around trust, and then you can take that and combine it with the user research you've done to try and narrow down what the solutions are. So that's how it's working broadly for our client programs that we run at Conversion. But what we're trying to do at the minute is deploy it more broadly into more public facing industry insight stuff. At the minute we have a really interesting project going on to benchmark 5 different subscription brands. So I think it's Netflix, Spotify, Kiwiko, and HelloFresh, and Duolingo. to really understand how they're dealing with the shared challenge of subscription. So the idea is that you take a load of websites with very different value propositions that in some ways don't share a lot with one another, and try and dissect out the common theme, which is that they're all trying to effectively sell subscriptions. So yeah, this should be a great piece of work that should come out relatively soon. And our hope is that these kinds of initiatives, these kinds of projects that take a kind of broader cross industry view and can be shared more widely, are something that can provide really practical examples, really useful insights for people across the CRO industry. And I think it comes back to some of the same ambition that's there with the levers framework around trying to be part of a wider conversation. We really want to get more feedback from people, understand more about how other people are working, and try and put resources out there that can be as helpful as possible to other CRO practitioners.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Again,
Thank you, sir.
Edmund Beggs, serial consultant for conversion.com, and is the mastermind behind all of this crazy, crazy things. Like, I don't like,
Yeah.
your mind is amazing. And thank you so much for bringing this amazing framework and the benchmarking and all that, conversion.com.
Well, that is one.
Yeah. And yeah, glad to have you here. Again, this is Charlotte Bomford, and thank you for watching Experiment Nation.
This is Romo Santiago from Experiment Nation. Every week we share interviews with and conference sessions by our favorite conversion rate optimizers from around the world. So if you like this video, smash that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us a bunch.